Hey guys, it's Sarah and her twin sister Sarah here to make a vocabulary video to help you learn your Chapter 11 vocab. The reason I have to do the mirror image is because it's the only way I could get the words to show up the right way on the screen. So, starting with word number 1, the human microbiome is just the collection of all the microbes that live in and on the human body. Microbial antagonism, number 2. Think antagonism, and antagonist, someone you fight against. So microbial antagonism is just microbes fighting each other for resources, how they kind of like elbow each other in a space where they're all living together. True pathogens are organisms that cause disease in healthy people, so an otherwise healthy person who gets sick, that pathogen is a true pathogen, as opposed to an opportunistic pathogen, which is one that really only causes disease in otherwise not healthy people, those who are immunocompromised, so they have weakened immune systems. So little kids, old people, people with AIDS, people who are on chemotherapy, lots of different reasons that immune systems can be weakened. But these types of pathogens don't typically cause disease in otherwise healthy people with healthy immune systems. A virulence factor is something that a bacteria or fungus or virus produces that actually leads to disease in the human. So toxins, or there's a whole bunch of toxins that we'll talk about. Exogenous is the next word. It just means coming from the outside. Exo means on the outside. Phagocytes are cells that eat things. Phago means to eat or swallow. So there are several types of white blood cells that we'll learn about, and the ones that can eat other cells, like they can eat bacteria or virus particles, are called phagocytes. Leukocidins are a type of virulence factor. It literally means cidin, means to kill, like homicidal, remember? And leuco means white. So leukocidins are chemicals that kill white blood cells, and these are compounds that can be produced by pathogens. Exoenzymes are enzymes that are secreted. They are made by bacteria and they secrete them out. Hemolysins are another type of toxin. They cause the lysis or lysine breaking of hemo, blood cells. So they cause red blood cell lysis. Endotoxin is also known as LPS, or lipopolysaccharide. It is found on the inside, endo, of gram-negative cells. So when gram-negative cells die and burst open, then the endotoxin is released, and it causes fever and shock and all kinds of bad things in sick humans. Necrosis is the term for tissue death. Some toxins lead to tissue death, cause necrosis. Necrosis also happens if you lack blood flow to a region. So sometimes an infection can be so dense that it literally blocks off the blood supply to a tissue and causes it to die. Necrosis. Inflammation. Inflammation is typically what happens. It's the presentation of an infection. Inflammation is characterized by redness, swelling, heat, and pain are the characteristic signs of inflammation. An abscess is like a nest of bacteria and pus. So it's like a concentrated local infection that involves a lot of bacteria and pus. Lymphadenitis is it's swelling of the lymph nodes, or inflammation of the lymph nodes. So anytime you have an infection, your local lymph nodes, which is where your immune cells live and breed, the bacteria can drain into that lymph node, and then you start getting multiplication of all of those white blood cells and immune cells in that local nearby lymph node. So when you have a sore throat, you often can feel swollen lymph nodes in your neck. If you had an infection in if you cut your thigh and it got infected, you would have swollen lymph nodes in your groin. So the draining lymph nodes, when they become swollen from an infection, we call that lymphadenitis. Leukocytosis. Leuko means white, cyto means cell, and osis means condition of. It's a condition of white blood cells. When you have an infection in your body, you ramp up white blood cell production. And this can be seen in a blood test. If you have your blood drawn, they can see an increase in white blood cells. That's a sign you have infection, leukocytosis. Septicemia literally means a condition of septic blood. This is what happens when you have an infection in your blood, and basically your blood transports stuff to all over your body. So if you have septicemia, you have an infection all over your body at once, and it's very dangerous, high mortality rates. Bacteremia specifically means bacteria in the blood, and bacteremia can lead to sepsis, an infection. Sometimes bacteria just get into the blood and don't cause an infection and replicate there, but that's still concerning because they can use the blood to travel to other sites. So bacteremia is having bacteria in the blood, septicemia is having bacteria and inflammation and disease and replication of those bacteria in the blood. Asymptomatic is when you have a disease, but you don't have any symptoms of it. So a lot of STDs are sort of textbook examples of asymptomatic infections. People can carry chlamydia, gonorrhea, HPV, all of those things without actually having any signs or symptoms of disease, and then they can transmit it to other people who then maybe do have symptoms. So asymptomatic infections mean that there is an infection, but you just don't realize it because there's no symptoms. Latency is sort of like going into a dormant hiding state. So we talked about viruses being able to go into a latent state, but bacteria can do it too. Tuberculosis is particularly famous for latency. Sort of a quiet hidden infection that can then re-emerge. Sequelae looks kind of like the word sequel. They have the same root. So a sequel is like the next movie, like you read a book or go see a movie and then there's a sequel. It's the one that comes after that. So same thing, a sequelae is a disease that comes after the first one. So a classic example is strep throat can progress to something called scarlet fever. And so the scarlet fever is the sequelae of the strep throat. It was basically a complication or a secondary disease that arose from untreated strep throat. So sequelae, things you want to avoid. Incubation period. This is a period when you get infected with a pathogen. The incubation period is sort of like the lag phase of growth. So they're just getting situated, they're starting to metabolize, starting to produce some toxins. You don't feel sick yet during the incubation period. This is when you've caught the disease, but it hasn't presented itself yet. So it's still incubating. It takes a couple of days sometimes before you start actually seeing symptoms. The first set of symptoms you start seeing is this prodromal stage. So this is sort of the nondescript symptoms, like when you're just sort of feeling crappy before you get sick. You maybe have a headache. You feel like your head, just a lot of pressure in your head. And then during the real active part of the infection, you actually have a cough, your nose is stuffy. But that one day or so, that prodromal day where your body's just feeling like crap, that's the prodromal phase. Convalescent period is at the end of an infection when you're getting better. That's convalescent really means recovering. So you're getting better. You can still transmit disease during that time though. Reservoir is an environmental site or an animal. It's some source of infection. So where an infectious pathogen lives in the environment. So there's a reservoir of Giardia in the local pond, so you shouldn't drink out of it. Or wild raccoons, it could be a reservoir for rabies. Or some dirty clothes in the corner that are contaminated with smallpox, could be a reservoir of smallpox. I don't know, I'm just pulling stuff out of my butt. A carrier is a person who has a pathogen in or on their body, but they're not actually sick. So is it usually an asymptomatic person who's walking around spreading a disease without necessarily knowing it. Zoonosis is any disease that comes from an animal. So sometimes viruses can infect both animals and humans. So any disease that you get from an animal. Rabies is something you get from an animal. Flu you can get from an animal. Some diseases you can't get from animals, so we're safe from them. Contagious just means you can spread it from person to person. Most pathogens are contagious. Most bacterial, fungal, viral diseases are contagious. There's a couple that are technically not. Tetanus, for example, is not contagious. You get it from stepping on a nail, but you can't give tetanus to another person. So there's very few examples of infectious diseases that are not contagious. Contagious means it can spread from person to person. Horizontal transmission is spreading something contagious. So giving a disease to a peer or another person, it's spreading sideways. All right. Vertical transmission is spreading through the family tree, down the family tree. So vertical transmission is spreading down, up and down. That's from a mother to a child in utero. So you spreading a disease to your offspring. HIV can be spread vertically during pregnancy. If somebody's not taking their antivirals, if they don't have antivirals to take, they could spread HIV. HIV could be passed on to the infant. A lot of sexually transmitted diseases actually can be transmitted to the infant during labor. So there's a lot of protocols to prevent vertical transmission. Nosocomial infections, this is a fancy term for infections that are acquired in a hospital setting. Think about it, sick people go to hospitals and they stay there, probably in a room next to people who are immunocompromised. So lots of opportunities to get sick in the hospital. Might be counterintuitive. You think you go there to get better, but a lot of people go there and get sick. Koch's postulates. Robert Koch or Robert Koch, I don't know how to say it properly, German name. He was one of the fathers of germ theory of disease, and he really came up with a set of logical rules or logical steps to take in order to pin a disease on a specific microbe. So rather than just saying, oh, we think that this microbe causes this disease because we've seen it in a lot of animals, it's a series of steps of saying, okay, you think that this microbe causes the disease, so you're going to isolate this microbe, you're going to transfer it to a new organism, you're going to see if it develops the disease, and you're going to re-isolate it. So just a series of steps to prevent people from jumping to conclusions and blaming a microbe for a disease that it doesn't cause until you prove that it actually causes that disease. So it's a series of steps to prove that an organism does, in fact, cause a disease. Epidemiology is the branch of medicine or science that studies the spread of disease. So they're the sort of the disease sleuths. They're the investigators. Where did this come from? How did this happen? Mortality rate is something that epidemiologists are interested in. That is the number of people that are killed by a disease or an infection, what have you, usually per year or per month or per time period. Different than the morbidity rate, which is how many people are sick from it. So mortality rate is actually how many people die from something. Index case is like patient 0. The first case of an outbreak is called the index case. Outbreaks can be pandemic, meaning they are widespread. Think pan means all, so they are happening all over the place, all over the world, usually multiple continents. Versus an endemic outbreak or disease, which is localized to a specific area or region or country and is not widespread, but is prevalent, but just in a small area. So that's endemic. Endemic, small area, local. Pandemic, wide range of areas all over the place. All right, that's the end.